She vanished to pee. 26 days later, she was still writing, not pleas, but directions to a husband she could not reach. The forest kept its mouth shut. The Appalachian Trail kept walking on. Geraldine Largay called herself Inchworm. Trail names are gifts given by other hikers on the Appalachian Trail, and Inchworm was one of those affectionate titles that said more than it seemed. She wasn't fast. She didn't need to be. She measured progress not in miles conquered, but in small, determined pieces, step by step, like the patient crawl of a green caterpillar inching along a branch. She made her way up one of the toughest hiking routes in America. It was July 22nd, 2013, the kind of Maine morning that feels older than the country itself. Damp air like wool on the skin, the trees standing so close together they seemed to whisper in private. The Appalachian Trail had carried her hundreds of miles already. This was not the beginning. This was a middle, the steady hum where hikers stop worrying about novelty and begin thinking about endurance. Jerry was 66 years old, but anyone who spoke with her on the trail remembered her brightness. She had a laugh that popped like a campfire spark, quick and warm, and she had the discipline of someone who had been a nurse in the Air Force. She knew how to care for people, how to work through discomfort, how to keep steady under pressure. Yet the trail has no respect for resumes or reputations. It erases the past and reduces every person to boots, sweat, and willpower. That morning, Jerry adjusted the straps on her pack, shifted the weight across her shoulders, and checked her map. She was walking north, toward Baxter State Park, the endpoint for every hiker who dreamed of finishing. It was a long way yet, but she had been writing letters and notes back home to her husband, George, with cheerfulness. She was proud of herself. She was strong. She had momentum. At the Poplar Ridge lean-to, she greeted fellow hikers, ate a modest breakfast, a power bar, maybe some trail mix, and relace her boots. Around her, the forest was waking up a low hum, mosquitoes rising in their invisible swarms, the flutter of warblers, the faint scuffle of chipmunks darting between logs. Everything was ordinary. Everything was as it should be. And then came the simple, necessary, entirely human decision that would change the story forever. She needed to step off the trail, just for a few minutes. For privacy. Every hiker does it. The woods are full of hidden paths carved by small necessities. She set down her pack, or maybe carried it loosely with her, no one knows for certain, and walked a short distance into the trees. The trail vanished behind her in seconds. That's the thing about dense Maine woods. The path is only obvious when you're on it. A few steps away, the white blaze markers painted on trees are hidden by undergrowth. The worn dirt of the trail is swallowed by moss and needles. And suddenly every direction looks the same. It's a magician's trick performed by nature. Turn once, and the world rearranges itself. When Jerry finished and turned back, the Appalachian Trail was gone. At first, she didn't panic. She had hiked hundreds of miles. After all, she had maps, a compass, the kind of experience that keeps fear in check. She retraced her steps, or thought she did, but the ferns had closed, the brush shifted, and the slope of the ground was deceptive. 10 feet became 20. 20 became 50. She slowed, scanning for the familiar line of dirt, the painted blaze, the footprint she had left. The forest gave her nothing. Still calm, she adjusted her course. The sun was somewhere above, though filtered through thick spruce branches. The air smelled of wet bark and iron-rich soil. She walked in one direction, then another, listening for voices from the lean-to. Nothing, just the breathing silence of endless trees. Minutes stretched. The knot of unease in her chest grew tighter. She told herself not to let imagination run wild. People lose the trail and find it again. The Appalachian Trail is not a maze designed to kill you. It is a path walked by thousands every year. She would rejoin it, laugh at herself, tell the story later. But the forest is patience. It waits for your confidence to falter. As the sun climbed, the shadows changed, disorienting her sense of direction. She tried to climb a small rise, hoping for a better vantage. From above, she saw only more green, more ridges layered against each other like waves of frozen sea. No lean-to, no hikers, no thread of trail cutting through the landscape. She descended carefully, sweat prickling across her back. She took out her phone, a small lifeline to the world beyond the wilderness. Signal flickered, 1 bar, then none. She typed a message to George. Lost since yesterday. Off trail 3 or 4 miles. Call police for what to do, please. XOX. The words fell immediate, desperate, but composed. She pressed send. The phone screen went blank, then displayed the hollow verdict. Message failed to deliver. The morning stretched on. Jerry rationed her energy, checked her compass, tried to orient herself toward where she believed the trail must be. She took careful steps, aware that panic would only scatter her further. Still, the sensation of being swallowed by the forest grew stronger. Every spruce looked like the last. Every patch of moss was a mirror of the one before. Time bends strangely when you're lost. 10 minutes can feel like an hour. An hour can collapse into a blur. By midday, Jerry's water bottle was half empty. She remembered the rules of survival. Water first, then shelter, then food. She was methodical. She had always been methodical. But something else crept into her awareness as the day passed. The silence was too complete. Even the forest noises, the chatter of birds, the scurrying of squirrels, seemed to retreat, leaving her in a bubble of eerie quiet. The deeper she walked, the more it felt like the trees had leaned inward, closing ranks. By evening, she admitted it. She was lost, not just misplaced for a few minutes, but truly separated from the trail. The lean-to, the other hikers, the white blazes gone. She found a relatively flat spot between 2 trees and pulled out her small tarp. She had done this many times before. It wasn't fear that pressed against her now, but a heavier companion. Solitude. She built a small fire. Flames licked upward, fragile and orange against the damp wood. She sat beside it, journal open on her lap, and began to write. The entries were brief, but the act of putting pen to paper steadied her hands. The first night was long. The forest was no longer friendly. It was watchful. Every crack of a branch sounded deliberate, every gust of wind like a whisper. Lying in her sleeping bag, Jerry felt the weight of the woods above her, pressing down. She closed her eyes, whispered prayer, and told herself that tomorrow she would find the trail. She had to. And somewhere, only a few hundred yards away, hikers passed along the Appalachian Trail, unaware that one of their own had stepped sideways into a different fate entirely. The Appalachian Trail is often romanticized in guidebooks and hiking memoirs as a pilgrimage, a sacred ribbon of wilderness where the soul is tested and reborn. Stretching more than 2,100 miles from Georgia to Maine, it lures thousands each year who crave escape from the noise of modern life. But beneath its beauty lies something far less forgiving. The dense forests, endless ridgelines, and unpredictable weather do not bend to human will. And for every hiker who returns home with stories of triumph, there are others who never come back. Geraldine Largay, known to friends and family as Inchworm because of her slow but steady hiking pace, was one of those dreamers who longed for the trail's promise of transformation. She wasn't a young adventurer fresh out of college, nor was she a hardened mountaineer. At 66 years old, she carried a gentle optimism that set her apart from the rugged image of a typical thru hiker. She had retired from her career as a nurse, was married to her beloved husband George, and dreamed of finishing a bucket list journey that would crown her golden years with meaning. But from the very beginning, Geraldine's hike was different. Unlike many thru hikers who prepare obsessively, studying maps, logging training miles, and testing gear, she leaned more on her heart than her technical skills. She was enthusiastic but inexperienced, friendly but easily flustered when things went wrong. Fellow hikers described her as kind, full of warmth, someone who made you feel you'd known her forever. Yet they also noticed she struggled with navigation, often relying heavily on others for guidance. That summer 2013, she had made it deep into the northern stretch of the Appalachian Trail, trekking through the remote forests of western Maine. She was more than 900 miles into her journey, her boots worn, her face tanned and weathered by the trail. It should have been the triumphant stretch where she closed in on her dream of finishing the entire at. Instead, it became the stage for her disappearance, a vanishing act that would puzzle rescuers, haunt her family, and unearth chilling details only years later. On the morning of July 22nd, Geraldine was hiking alone. Her hiking partner had left the trail days earlier, and though she was aware of her limitations, she pressed on by herself. George, her husband, was tracking her progress through prearranged rendezvous points, where he would meet her with supplies. Their system was built on trust. She would follow the white trailblazers that marked the Appalachian path, and he would be waiting at the next crossing. But the wilderness has a way of dismantling even the simplest of plans. That morning, Geraldine left the trail, perhaps to relieve herself, perhaps to explore a side path, perhaps to take a brief shortcut. No one knows exactly why, but she strayed just far enough that the thin thread connecting her to the Appalachian Trail snapped. At first, it might have seemed harmless. The forest floor was soft, the air was humid, and the trees stood like cathedral pillars around her. She could still hear faint sounds, the crunch of distant boots, the rustle of leaves disturbed by other hikers. Maybe she told herself she'd step back onto the trail within moments. But the Appalachian wilderness plays tricks on the senses. Sound carries strangely. Light filters down in fractured shafts that confuse direction. Turn once, then twice, and suddenly the path is gone. By late morning, Geraldine realized she was no longer on the trail. Panic began to bloom. She pulled out her compass, but without a map, the needle only confirmed what she already feared. She had no bearings. She tried retracing her steps, pushing through thick underbrush, circling trees that all looked the same. With each passing hour, she went deeper, farther, her inchworm pace now working against her. When George arrived at their planned meeting point that afternoon, she never showed. At first, he wasn't alarmed. Perhaps she was behind schedule, moving slowly. Perhaps she had paused to rest or met other hikers. But when night fell and there was still no sign of her, dread began to creep in. By morning, it became undeniable. Geraldine was missing. What followed was one of the largest search and rescue operations in Maine's history. Teams of wardens, forest rangers, and volunteers scoured the woods. Helicopters combed the treetops with thermal imaging. Bloodhounds traced faint scents along the trail. Flyers with Geraldine's smiling face were posted in nearby towns. To those who knew the woods, it seemed impossible that she could simply vanish. The Appalachian Trail may be vast, but it is also well-traveled. Surely, someone would stumble across her. But days stretched into weeks. And still, nothing. No gear left behind. No clothing. No footprints. Geraldine seemed to have evaporated into the wilderness itself. Searchers began whispering theories. Had she been injured and carried away by wildlife? Had she wandered so far off course that she was beyond their grid? Or had something darker happened? An encounter with someone who did not want her found? The eerie silence unsettled even the most seasoned rescuers. Typically, lost hikers are located within a few days. But Geraldine had disappeared without a trace, as though the forest had swallowed her whole. George clung desperately to hope, refusing to believe that his wife of 42 years could simply be gone. Night after night, he replayed their last conversations, wondering if he had missed a warning sign, a hesitation, a plea for him to stop her from continuing alone. Back in the small trail towns, the case became legend almost overnight. Hikers whispered her name around campfires, warning each other not to stray from the blazes, not to underestimate Maine's wilderness. Locals spoke of the forest as if it were alive, capable of choosing who returned and who didn't. Geraldine's story became a ghost tale in the making, her absence an echo that seemed to linger in the pines. Yet while the outside world speculated, deep in the woods, Geraldine was still alive. Alone, frightened, but determined. She had set up a small campsite on higher ground, hoping the searchers would find her. She rationed her food, conserved her energy, and wrote entries in her journal, messages that would one day reveal her inner battle with despair and faith. But no one knew this then. To the world, she was already gone, her fate a haunting question mark that hovered over the Appalachian Trail. And so the mystery deepened. Geraldine Largay, the kind-hearted woman who set out to prove that dreams had no age limit, had vanished in broad daylight on one of America's most famous trails. And for more than 2 years, no one would know what really happened to her, or the heartbreaking truths she left behind. The forest had her now. The search for Geraldine Largay began with urgency, but within hours it morphed into something far larger, something resembling a war against the wilderness itself. Maine's forests are not gentle. They are deep, rugged, and indifferent to human panic. The terrain where Geraldine vanished is known to even veteran hikers as some of the most unforgiving stretches of the Appalachian Trail. The trees grow so tightly together that sunlight struggles to penetrate, creating pockets of gloom even at midday. Streams carve deceptive channels that disorient hikers. Trails vanish under fallen leaves, only to reappear 100 feet away. For someone already struggling with direction, it was a labyrinth designed for despair. Within 24 hours, the Maine Warden Service assembled an army of searchers. Helicopters roared overhead, their blades chopping the sky as they scanned the canopy for signs of movement, smoke, or the flash of gear. On the ground, lines of volunteers stretched into the woods, each person spaced just far enough apart to cover maximum ground, their voices echoing as they called Geraldine's name. Jerry Largay, if you can hear us, call back. But the forest gave nothing in return, only the whisper of wind through branches, the occasional crack of a twig, the steady hum of insects. Searchers pressed deeper, beating back the brush, their eyes scanning for anything. Footprints, scraps of fabric, broken twigs. But Geraldine remained invisible, tucked away in a labyrinth like a ghost. Her husband, George, was at the command center, pacing restlessly. He had been the one waiting at the rendezvous point the day she disappeared. He replayed the hours over and over, the anticipation of seeing her walk out of trees, the rising anxiety as time passed, the moment panic finally broke through. Now he waited helplessly while strangers combed the forest of a woman who had been his best friend for more than 4 decades. Despite the resources, the days slipped by with no progress. Search dogs sniffed along ridges and ravines, sometimes catching faint traces of scent that seemed to vanish into thin air. Helicopters spotted nothing but endless green. The search crews kept returning to the same grim conclusion. If Geraldine had wandered even a mile off the Maine Trail, she could be anywhere. And with each passing night, her chances of survival dwindled. But here's where the story twists, because Geraldine had not given up. Deep in the woods, she was alive, holding on to hope with a stubbornness that shocked even those who later read her journal. She had found a patch of high ground and set up camp. She gathered what little she had left. Her tent, her pack, her dwindling food supply. She organized her gear carefully, like a nurse preparing for triage. She told herself she only had to wait, that the voices she thought she heard in the distance, the faint roar of helicopters, meant that rescue was near. But the cruelest trick the forest played was silence. The searchers and Geraldine came agonizingly close to each other, sometimes within a few hundred yards. Yet the thickness of the woods swallowed sound, muffled cries, and distorted direction. A call could vanish into moss and timber. Helicopter blades might as well have been thunderclouds. Geraldine sat quietly, listening, her heart surging at every faint noise. But no one ever came. Back at the search headquarters, doubt began creeping in. Rescuers wondered if they were chasing a shadow. Perhaps she had left the trail entirely and hitched a ride. Perhaps she had staged a disappearance. Such theories are common in missing person cases when days turn into weeks. But George rejected them outright. He knew his wife. She wasn't someone who ran from responsibility. She had been proud of her hike, determined to finish. If she could have come back, she would have. The eerie part? They were right. Geraldine was still out there, alive, waiting. But with each sunrise, her strength waned. She rationed her food until it was gone, then survived on berries and sips of water. She wrote in her journal, chronicling her days, her thoughts, her prayers. The entries were both heartbreaking and resilient. She begged that whoever found her would deliver the words to George, so he would know she had fought, that she had not simply given up. Meanwhile, the official search effort ballooned. Over the course of 2 weeks, it drew more than 120 people per day, wardens, forest rangers, volunteers, even members of the Air National Guard. They swept across more than 23 square miles of wilderness. Statistically, someone should have found her, But statistics don't matter in a place where nature sets the rules. By the end of the second week, hope was flickering. Officials began to reduce the scale of the operation, unwilling to keep pouring resources into what seemed increasingly like a recovery mission instead of a rescue. Families of other lost hikers came forward with grim reminders. In this wilderness, people often vanish for good. Geraldine's case seemed destined to join those unsolved legends, the hikers who step off a trail and are never seen again. But George refused to quit. He lingered in Maine long after most volunteers returned home. He retraced sections of the trail himself, spoke with locals, begged officials to keep the case open. "She's out there," he insisted. "She's waiting for me." And he was right. For nearly a month after her disappearance, Geraldine endured. She kept her camp organized, kept her journal updated, kept her spirit alive. She even made peace with the possibility of death, framing her final words not with bitterness but with love. She wrote prayers. She wrote to George. She wrote about the sky, the trees, the birds, remnants of beauty in the wilderness that had become her prison. But the strangest part was how close she had been all along. Less than 2 miles from the Appalachian Trail, less than a mile from search grids. At times, rescuers had unknowingly passed near her camp. Yet in the tangled embrace of Maine's forest, those small distances might as well have been oceans. The forest was no longer just a backdrop. It had become an active participant, a cruel hunter playing with its prey. It let searchers come close, then swallowed their voices. It gave Geraldine hope, then sealed her cries in silence. For outsiders, the case became an unsettling reminder. The trail doesn't just test you. Sometimes it takes you. And so, the official search ended, but the mystery did not. Geraldine was still out there, alive, waiting, scribbling her thoughts on paper that no one would read for years. The forest wasn't finished with her yet. By the time the official search effort wound down, the mood around the Appalachian Trail had shifted from determination to quiet dread. For 2 solid weeks, hundreds of boots had trampled the mossy forest floor. Helicopters had carved circles in the skies, and dogs had sniffed through ridgelines and ravines. And yet, nothing. Not a scrap of clothing. Not a broken branch that seemed fresh. Not a single piece of proof that Geraldine Largay had even been there. To those who live and breathe the backcountry, such silence is its own kind of horror. The wilderness usually leaves traces. A misplaced footprint, a dropped wrapper, a torn piece of fabric snagged on a branch. But Geraldine's absence was total, and that vacuum of evidence invited something darker to creep in. Fear, and with it, whispers. In trail towns nearby, hikers traded theories over beers in dim-lit pubs. Some swore they'd seen Geraldine days after she supposedly vanished, walking quietly with her head down. Others insisted no. She had been taken, lured by someone hiding in the woods, the same way campfire stories describe phantom hermits or restless spirits. The Appalachian Trail, after all, has its share of legends. The Bennington Triangle in Vermont, the disappearances in the Smokies, the countless names etched into memorials along the 2,100-mile path. To the locals, Geraldine's case felt like it joined that long, unsettling lineage. Yet the truth, hidden in Geraldine's own journal, was even more chilling. Alone in her small campsite, she was fighting a private war against time and silence. She had rationed her food until it dwindled into nothing. She gathered water when she could, boiling it when possible, though her fuel supply grew scarce. She wrote, not in frantic scrawls, but in steady, measured handwriting, as if recording her own story would anchor her spirit. Each entry was a mixture of hope and resignation, of prayer and fear. "Please find me," she wrote. "I am hungry and scared." But no one heard her pleas. The search had come agonizingly close. So close, in fact, that at times Geraldine could hear the distant buzz of helicopters or the faint barks of search dogs. Her heart would leap, her hands trembling as she prepared to wave a signal. But the sounds always drifted away. The forest played cruel games, muffling cries and twisting direction. She even considered starting a fire, but in the damp Maine summer, with rain showers passing through, flames were hard to coax into life. Worse, she feared if she failed, her precious matches would be wasted. Every decision was heavy, every hesitation deadly. And through it all, Geraldine clung to faith, her love for George, her trust that her story wasn't finished. Back at the search headquarters, George refused to surrender to despair. He kept her picture pinned to bulletin boards, kept his phone charged at all hours, kept pacing as though sheer willpower could pull her out of the forest. He spoke to wardens, pleaded with officials, begged them not to give up. But resources were finite, and officials had their own brutal calculus. After 2 weeks, most lost hikers in this terrain are found dead. Still, some wardens were haunted. They lay awake at night, replaying the search grids, second-guessing their coverage. How could so many people miss her? Was she hidden in plain sight? Or had she, impossibly, walked out of the woods and slipped into some other fate? The mystery carved itself into the psyche of the trail. Hikers began to walk more carefully, eyes darting to the tree line, ears pricking at every snap of a twig. They thought of her when they unrolled their sleeping bags at night, wondering if Geraldine's last bed had been so different from theirs. A story that should have been a simple tragedy, a hiker lost, a life cut short, was mutating into something more spectral, as though the forest itself had taken her, erased her, claimed her as its own. But Geraldine was still alive. That was a horror. The slow, unseen unraveling of hope, not in some distant realm, but right there, hidden in the folds of the very forest searchers swore they had scoured. She was 2 miles from the trail, less than a mile from major search grids, her bright red tent blending into the shadows where pine needles carpeted the ground. So close, and yet forever out of reach. As the official search dwindled, Geraldine's isolation deepened. The forest grew quieter, the noises of helicopters and dogs fading until only the rustle of leaves and the calls of distant birds remained. The silence pressed against her like a weight, whispering that she had been abandoned. She began to face the possibility that no one was coming. Her journal became her lifeline. In it, she wrote messages not only to George, but to whoever might one day find her remains. Her words were heartbreakingly tender. Gratitude for her life, apologies for the grief she knew her family would bear, instructions for what to do when her body was found. It was not just a record. It was a goodbye written in real time, a testament to a woman refusing to let the forest erase her completely. And yet, for all its cruelty, the wilderness showed her fragments of beauty. She wrote a bird song in the mornings, of shafts of sunlight piercing through the canopy, of the strange peace that came in the stillness. She was not just trapped. She was suspended between 2 worlds, alive but slipping toward death, tethered to both terror and wonder. Meanwhile, George drove the same back roads over and over, searching for any sign that might have been overlooked. Locals grew accustomed to seeing him, a man hollowed by grief but unbroken in resolve. He carried the weight of knowing that while the world was moving on, he could not until she was found. But the cruelest truth was this: Geraldine would never be found alive. Her body would lie in a hidden campsite for over 2 years, undisturbed, while hikers and hunters passed unknowingly nearby. Only in 2015 would her remains be discovered, along with a journal that revealed the depth of her endurance and the quiet grace of her final days. For now, though, in those weeks after the search ended, the mystery hardened into legend. The forest had consumed her. The trail had claimed another soul, and the echoes in the pines carried her name. By the 3rd week after Geraldine's disappearance, the Appalachian Trail in western Maine had changed. What was once a vibrant artery of hikers chasing summer dreams now felt heavy, burdened by the weight of unanswered questions. Hikers walked more quietly, eyes scanning the woods, whispering her name in nervous tones. The trail was haunted not by ghosts, but by the unnerving truth that someone could step away for just a moment and never return. The Maine Warden Service had formally scaled back the search. Resources were redirected to other cases. Helicopters were grounded. Volunteers went home. But in the minds of many, the case was far from over. Conversations rippled through trail shelters and small towns alike. How could she vanish without a trace? Even veteran hikers admitted that Geraldine's case unsettled them in ways others hadn't. The Appalachian Trail is long, but it is not empty. Even in the wild stretches of Maine, hikers pass each other daily. To imagine a woman in her 60s, carrying gear, moving slowly, vanishing in broad daylight seemed absurd. Some theories grew darker. Maybe she hadn't gotten lost. Maybe she had been lured. The Appalachian wilderness has long been stalked by rumors of shadowy figures. Hermits living off-grid, drifters using the trail to avoid notice, people who thrive in a silence where no law can reach. A handful of murders had happened along the trail in past decades, enough to fuel imaginations. Was it possible Geraldine had crossed paths with someone who didn't want her found? George, though, dismissed such talk. He clung to the simplest and most painful explanation. His wife had gotten lost, and no one had been able to reach her in time. He continued searching privately, retracing roads and speaking with hunters, praying for any clue. His dedication became its own quiet legend, a man refusing to let his wife's story end in ambiguity. Meanwhile, Geraldine's absence transformed into myth. Hikers passed along the details like folklore. She was called Inchworm because she hiked slow. She loved talking to people. She was so close to finishing. The details blurred into a cautionary tale. Every time a hiker strayed off-trail to relieve themselves, someone would mutter, "Remember Inchworm," as if invoking her name might ward off the same fate. And all the while, Geraldine was still there, alive, waiting. Her campsite had become a fragile sanctuary in the midst of despair. She positioned her tent on higher ground, near enough to water but safe from flooding rains. She laid out her gear carefully, keeping order in the face of chaos. Each morning, she woke with a dull ache of hunger but forced herself to keep writing in her journal, to keep documenting her existence. Her entries reveal a woman fully aware of her situation. She knew time was against her. She wrote prayers, apologies, declarations of love. One note read, "When you find my body, please call my husband George. It will be the greatest kindness." The words strike like ice because of what they reveal, not hopelessness, but clarity. She was facing death with dignity, refusing to vanish silently into the forest shadows. But her strength had limits. The days stretched into weeks, and her body began to fail. Hunger gnawed at her constantly. Sleep became restless, haunted by dreams of food and the faces of loved ones. Insect and dampness invaded her tent. Still, she endured, driven by faith, driven by the faint hope that one more day might bring rescue. And the cruelest twist of all, searchers had come within a stone's throw of her camp. Maps later revealed that organized searches had passed less than a mile away, close enough that she may have heard voices, dogs, or distant footsteps. She had even tried to signal at one point, moving toward a potential noise, but the density of the woods betrayed her. To be so close, and yet invisible, is its own form of torment. In town, the theories multiplied. Some insisted she must have staged her disappearance. Others whispered about murder, abduction, or suicide. But the truth, that she had endured for weeks in silence, hidden by nothing more than trees and shadows, was stranger than any fiction. Her vanishing point was not dramatic. She hadn't been dragged away. She hadn't fallen into a ravine. She hadn't stumbled across a predator. She had simply taken a few steps off the trail and been swallowed by a wilderness that does not care for human mistakes. That's the true terror of her story. Because if it could happen to Geraldine, it could happen to anyone. In those woods, a mile is an abyss. A compass without a map is a curse. And silence is the loudest sound of all. The legend of Inchworm was sealed, not because of what was found, but because of what wasn't. She was gone, and the trail was left with nothing but questions. Yet the forest does not keep secrets forever. 2 years later, hunters would stumble upon her campsite and uncover the truth. A truth both devastating and awe-inspiring. Her journal would tell the story of a woman who did not give up, who survived far longer than anyone thought possible, who faced death with extraordinary grace. But for now, in the summer of 2013, Geraldine remained the vanishing point. A woman lost in plain sight, her story written in whispers among the pines. The Appalachian Trail was alive with desperation in the weeks after Geraldine Largay disappeared. Helicopters droned over the green canopy, their blades stirring the air as search parties pushed through the wilderness below. Radios cracked with static, dogs strained at their leashes, and rangers called her name into the endless woods. Yet every night, After hours of scouring ravines and ridges, the searchers returned empty-handed. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed her whole and was determined to keep its secret. By the second week, hope began to erode. Volunteers emerged from the brush exhausted, mosquito-bitten, muttering the same refrain. No sign. Nothing. Not a scrap of fabric. Not a footprint in the soft mud. Not a single broken branch to suggest her path. The void felt unnatural, like she had stepped off the trail and dissolved into the air. Some searchers whispered the woods were too quiet. The Maine wilderness normally thrummed with life. Birdsong, the sigh of wind, the rhythm of insects. But during those days, silence pressed in heavy and strange, as though the forest was holding its breath. For Geraldine's family, the silence was unbearable. Her husband, George, paced a command center where maps sprawled across tables, red lines marking the ground already covered. His optimism cracked but never collapsed. "She's strong," he told coordinators again and again, his voice raw. She wouldn't give up. Keep looking. His daughter Carrie gripped his hand at night, her voice trembling when she whispered, "Dad, what if she's gone?" He refused to answer. To admit the thought would be betrayal. As the search dragged on, theories multiplied. Some believed she had wandered too far, succumbed to the elements. Others whispered of abduction or foul play. Locals muttered darker things, that the Appalachian wilderness had always claimed people, leaving behind nothing but questions. Hunters had vanished here. Hikers had stepped off trail and never returned. Geraldine's disappearance, though, unsettled even the most hardened. She was careful, steady, experienced enough to update her family. And yet she was gone, leaving behind only one last unsent message. In some trouble. Got off trail. Now lost. Can you call AMC to see if a trail maintainer can help me? Somewhere north of Woods Road. Hugs and kisses. That text, trapped forever in her outbox, became a ghost of its own, a plea for help that never reached her husband. The wilderness fought back against the search. Spruce thickets grew, so dense a person could vanish a few yards away. Storms erased footprints, while swarms of black flies and mosquitoes tormented the weary volunteers. The dogs struggled in the July heat, their noses dulled. Rangers admitted that if Geraldine had strayed even a little off-trail, she might have crossed into a labyrinth where no one could find her. Still, they pressed on. At the height of the search, more than 100 people combed the mountains. But as weeks turned into months, the numbers dwindled. By late summer, only a handful remained. For George, the hardest part wasn't the waiting. It was the uncertainty. Every phone call jolted him awake. Every knock at the door made his chest tighten with hope that always dissolved into despair. He replayed his last conversations with Geraldine, tortured by what-ifs. Should he have insisted she carry a GPS beacon? Should he have stopped her altogether? Carrie tried to stay strong, but when the official search scaled back, she broke, sobbing, "It's like she's still out there somewhere, but we'll never know where." Locals had a saying, "The trail takes who it wants." To outsiders, it sounded superstitious. To those who lived beside the wilderness, it was a truth spoken from experience. Generations of hunters and hikers had disappeared here. Some later found as scattered bones, others never seen again. Geraldine's case, though, struck deeper because she'd been careful, grounded, loved. If the trail could take her, then it could take anyone. By late August, the official search was suspended. Missing person flyers with Geraldine's smiling face still clung to trailheads and bulletin boards. But the momentum was gone. A few volunteers still combed the woods on weekends. George refused to quit, returning again and again to mountains, chasing hunches across maps and ridges. "As long as I'm alive," he told reporters, "I'll keep looking." But the forest stayed silent. Geraldine was gone. Hikers who came after her paused on certain bends of the trail, speaking her name in low voices. Some swore that in the morning mist, when the woods were still and gray, they could almost hear her voice, faint, far away, calling out. The silence of the trail had become her legacy, and that silence was louder than any cry for help. 2 long years passed. Seasons turned over mountains like pages in an endless book. Summer's thick green foliage giving way to the fire autumn, then the snow-silenced winter, then the cautious rebirth of spring. Hikers trudged the Appalachian Trail, as they always had, unaware that just a few miles from the path they followed lay a secret that the wilderness had guarded jealously. For those who loved her, the absence had hardened into a strange, suffocating kind of limbo. Her husband, George, had grown older seemingly overnight, the grief carving deep lines into his face. Her daughter, Carrie, carried the raw ache of unresolved loss. Each holiday, each birthday, each milestone passed with an empty chair at the table and a question nobody could answer. Where is she? The trail community, too, carried the weight of her disappearance. Veteran hikers would point to her missing person flyers, still curling at the corners on weather-beaten trailhead boards, and warn newcomers to never underestimate the woods. The story of Inchworm, Geraldine's trail name, became a cautionary tale, a whisper reminder that even the most prepared hiker could vanish into the green abyss if fate tilted against them. What no one knew, what no one could have imagined, was that Geraldine had left behind a message, and it waited patiently, sealed inside a notebook in a tent no searcher had ever found. It was October 2015 when a forest surveyor stumbled across something strange in a patch of dense, overgrown wilderness more than 2 miles from the trail. At first, it was just a sagging tent, weather-stained and half-collapsed, its once bright fabric now dulled to a ghostly gray. Beside it, a small camping chair sat, as if waiting for its occupant to return. The surveyor froze. He knew instantly what he had found. The missing hiker. The one the whole state had searched for. A few feet from the tent lay skeletal remains, carefully sheltered by the surrounding trees. Time and the elements had done their quiet work, but the personal items were still there, her boots, her clothing, her pack. Nothing had been disturbed, nothing stolen. It was as though she had simply lain down, surrounded by her belongings, and waited. And inside the tent, tucked neatly into her belongings, was her journal. When investigators opened it, their breath caught. Geraldine had written to the very end. Her entries revealed the truth. She had gotten lost after stepping off the trail, disoriented in the dense forest. She had wandered until exhaustion overtook her, and then, displaying remarkable calm, she set up camp. For weeks, maybe even longer, she had rationed food, sipped water, and held on a hope that someone would find her. One haunting entry read, "When you find my body, please call my husband George and my daughter Carrie. Please let them know I love them. Please find it in your heart to accept I was at peace when I walked to this spot and set up camp. I have no fear. I am prepared." The words were both devastating and strangely serene. They stripped away the layers of speculation, the wild theories, the whispered rumors. Geraldine had not been abducted. She had not fallen to foul play. She had died quietly, with courage and dignity, waiting to be found. The question that burned afterward was simple. How had so many people missed her? Her campsite was less than 2 miles from the trail, close enough that voices might have carried on a still day. During the height of the search, hundreds of people had walked past. Helicopters had circled overhead. Dogs had scoured the ridges. Yet no one had reached that hidden pocket of wilderness. Search experts later explained that the spot was shielded by natural barriers. Thick spruce, tangled underbrush, uneven ground. Unless a person stumbled directly into it, the campsite was invisible, tucked away in the folds of the land. Geraldine had been there all along, just out of sight. The cruelest irony was that she had survived for weeks. Rescue had been so close. The sound of searchers, perhaps even the distant thrum of helicopters, may have reached her ears as she waited. But the wilderness had conspired to keep her hidden, and in the end, silence prevailed. When the news broke, the Largay family's grief found a sharp new edge. For George, the discovery was bittersweet. He finally knew what had happened, knew that his wife had faced her fate with courage. But the revelation that she had survived for so long, so near to help, tore him apart. "I should have been there," he confessed to a friend. "I should have found her." Her daughter, Carrie, read the journal entries over and over, clinging to her mother's words like lifelines. The fact that Geraldine had thought of them, written to them, even in her final days, offered a fragile kind of comfort, but it also deepened the ache of loss. The journal humanized Geraldine in a way that transformed her story from a mystery into a tragedy of almost unbearable poignancy. She hadn't simply vanished. She had endured, alone, for longer than anyone had imagined, and she had faced death not with panic, but with grace. The story of Geraldine Largay changed after the discovery. She was no longer just a woman who disappeared. She was a woman who had left behind words, a voice reaching out across the silence. Her journal made her more than a mystery. It made her a presence, a reminder. Hikers who passed near the site felt the weight of her story. Some reported chills, as if the woods themselves held onto her spirit. Others spoke of her courage, her calm, and how her words inspired them to prepare more carefully, to respect the trail's unforgiving power. Her trail name, Inchworm, became both a warning and a symbol. Step by step, inch by inch, she had moved along the Appalachian Trail with determination. Even in her final days, she had refused to surrender to despair. What haunted so many was not just her death, but the cruel proximity of survival. She had been within reach of rescue, close enough to almost hear the footsteps of those searching. The barrier was not distance, but visibility. She was unseen, hidden by the very landscape she had come to love. The Appalachian Trail had played a grim trick, keeping her concealed until it decided otherwise. And when she was finally found, it was not by searchers or rescuers, but by chance, years later. The silence of the trail had not been broken until then. Geraldine Largay's unseen campsite became a symbol of nature's indifference, of human fragility, and of the resilience of a woman who endured until her strength was gone. It was both a heartbreaking end and an eerie reminder that the wilderness keeps its secrets, sometimes for years, sometimes forever. The journal she left behind spoke louder than any ghost story. It was a love letter to her family, a farewell, and a testimony to the human spirit ability to face the darkest moment with clarity and peace. But as the world absorbed the truth of her final days, one question still lingered in the air. If she had survived so long, so close to rescue, why had no one reached her in time? The Appalachian Trail had its answer, and it wasn't done speaking. When the truth of Geraldine Largay's final days finally surfaced, it struck like a tremor that rippled across the country, shaking those who had followed the search and haunting those who had been part of it. Her name leapt from missing person flyers to national headlines. Newspapers carried her face. Documentaries dissected her path. Trail forums buzzed with grief and disbelief. People who had never stepped foot on the Appalachian Trail suddenly looked at its sprawling wilderness with suspicion, as if the forest itself had turned into a predator, patient and cunning. Geraldine was no longer just a missing hiker. She had become a symbol of how thin the line between safety and disappearance really is, and how mercilessly the wilderness could test it. But for those who loved her, the revelation was not deliverance. It was not closure. It was another wound, sharpened by cruel irony. Geraldine had not vanished in a far-off corner. She had not succumbed in a single night. Her campsite was close, so close to the well-trodden trail, where hundreds of searchers had called her name. She had endured not for hours, but for weeks, measuring out rations, scribbling thoughts in her journal, straining her ears for voices that never reached her. For all that time, she had lived in the shadow of rescue, hidden by a forest that drew its curtains tight. The land itself betrayed her. The Appalachian wilderness swallowed sound, swallowed sight. Helicopters circled, boots trampled past. Yet the pines kept her invisible. She was there alive, while the searchers returned empty-handed each night. When her journal was recovered, it was placed in George Largay's hands, and he carried it like a sacred object. Alone in the evenings, he traced her handwriting with his finger, as though he might touch her through the page. Some entries were simple, lists of food, sketches of the landscape. Others were intimate, whispered prayers written only for him and their daughter. Words of love, words of hope, words written as the days stretched unbearably long. She had not given up. She had clung fiercely to life and to her family. For George, the journal was both a comfort and a torment. Comfort, because she had thought of him until the end. Torment, because she had lasted so much longer than anyone believed. He could not stop imagining her sitting at the edge of her tent, listening for footsteps, waiting for a rescue that never came. She was right there, he told friends softly. Right there. We could have found her. The phrase became his echo of grief, a truth too heavy to put down. Searchers who had once walked those woods carried their own ghosts. They replayed their steps, asking how they had missed her. Some admitted that in the years that followed, they dreamed of her, standing just beyond the tree line, faintly calling for help. One ranger confessed he could no longer hike that stretch without hearing the wind and mistaking it for her voice. The forest had fooled them all, and the guilt lingered like smoke. Superstition grew around the site where her tent was found. Hikers said the woods there felt different, thicker, darker, as if time hung heavy in the air. Some called it a graveyard, haunted by her spirit. Hikers left offerings, flowers, tokens, handwritten notes folded into waterproof bags. Without a marker, the earth itself became a shrine. And yet, not all felt dread. Some felt reverence. Geraldine had not raged against her fate. She had not surrendered to despair. She had kept her dignity, her hope, her love alive until the end. To many, she became a symbol of resilience, proof that the human spirit can glow even when the wilderness presses in with silence and cold indifference. But the cruelest truth remained. Her tent had been less than 2 miles from the trail. She might have heard the crunch of boots, the thrum of helicopters, voices on the wind. She may have called out, only to hear her own cries swallowed by the trees. She was alive in the very heart of the search, but the forest cloaked her. It wasn't failure that doomed her, not neglect, not indifference. It was the land itself, rain that erased tracks, thickets that hid her shelter, ridges that swallowed sound. The trail she trusted became her betrayal. For her daughter Carrie, the discovery reshaped her grief. She imagined her mother enduring, writing, waiting. She pictured her seated at her tent's entrance, steady-eyed, pen in hand, knowing each word might be her last. The image was unbearable, and yet it filled her with pride. Her mother had not panicked. She had not surrendered. She had faced the unimaginable with courage, leaving love etched into her final days. Still, regret gnawed. The family replayed the timeline endlessly. What if that final text had gone through? What if the search grid had shifted? What if one more step had been taken in the right direction? The what-if circled endlessly, teeth in the dark. Even with the truth known, the silence of trail kept them captive. The media seized the story, eager to shape it into a lesson. Geraldine became a cautionary tale about technology, about equipment, about judgment. Experts debated what she should have done differently. But those who loved her knew this missed the heart of it. She had trusted herself, trusted the trail, and been betrayed by chance. To reduce her to a mistake stripped her story of its humanity. Her family resisted. She was more than a hiker who got lost, Carrie told reporters. She was a wife, a mother, a grandmother, a friend. She had a full life, a beautiful spirit. And when the hardest moment came, she faced it with love in her heart. That was the truth her journal revealed, the truth the world needed to see. Over time, Geraldine's story became part of the trail's mythology. Hikers whispered her name as they passed the site, some feeling the air grow heavier, the silence sharper. Others felt comfort, as if she lingered not as a ghost but as a guide, still inchworm, still moving step by step, watching over the lost. Her story lived in both shadows, eerie and tender, haunting and inspiring. But her family could not quiet the echoes. George still woke at night with her words etched in his mind. He still saw her campsite in his thoughts and wondered how many mornings she had risen with hope, how many evenings she had prayed to hear voices, how close salvation had come before slipping away. In later years, he returned to Maine, standing silently at the forest's edge. He said little, but those beside him understood. He was listening, for her voice in pines, for echoes the trail would never give back. Geraldine's story ended in a lonely tent deep in the woods, but it did not stop there. It became a whisper woven into the wilderness, a reminder that the trail gives wonder, but takes with equal measure. It endured in the words she left behind, transforming her from mystery into a presence that could never truly fade. And so she remained in the silence of the Appalachian pines, still there, unseen but never gone. The years after Geraldine's discovery did not bring silence. Instead, they brought a strange persistence, as though her story was unwilling to rest, caught between the living world and the wilderness that had claimed her. The Appalachian Trail is long and ancient, a thread of earth worn by millions of footsteps, but has always carried its own ghosts, and Geraldine became one of them. The place where her tent was found turned into a quiet pilgrimage site, a spot whispered about in campfire circles, a destination not marked on official maps, but known instinctively by hikers who listen to the trail's undercurrent. The pines there seemed darker, the soil heavier, as if it remembered too much. Some said the air chilled without reason as you stepped beneath the canopy. Others claimed they felt eyes on them, soft and watchful. Whether it was imagination or something more, almost everyone agreed that the forest itself had changed the day she was discovered. For locals in Maine, the story never really faded either. Hunters avoided that patch of forest, muttering that nothing good could come from setting traps or stands near a place that had swallowed a woman whole. Families told the story to newcomers as a warning, their voices dropping low, as if the pines might overhear. Even children whispered about the lady in the tent, spinning their own legends of a woman who had called for help until the trees drowned her voice. What had begun as a news story was morphing into folklore, with each retelling sharpening the edge between fact and myth. Geraldine was both herself and something larger now, both a mother who had died waiting and a phantom presence bound to the woods. But it was those who had loved her who carried the weight most directly. George aged faster in the years that followed, his hair whitening, his movements slowing, his grief never softening into acceptance. People who knew him said that it seemed as though a part of him had been left behind in that forest, stranded alongside his wife. He could laugh still, he could hold conversations, he could even seem whole, but when her name surfaced, something flickered in him, an old wound reopening. He admitted once that he still read her journal, still heard her voice and words, still pictured her handwriting even when his eyes blurred with tears. "She was waiting for me," he said quietly, almost to himself, as though repeating it might make the unbearable any easier. Carrie, too, struggled with the inheritance of her mother's final chapter. For years she had carried the image of Geraldine simply disappearing, swallowed quickly by wilderness. But the journal had changed that, reshaping her imagination into something both harder and stronger. Now she saw her mother sitting at the edge of her tent, gazing into the forest as the days stretched into weeks. She saw her writing, praying, holding on, and she carried both pride and sorrow in that vision. Friends said Carrie began to look more like her mother, not just in face but in manner. The way she paused before answering questions, the way her eyes seemed to drift when conversations turned quiet. It was as if the trail had marked her too, a generational scar carved by silence and waiting. The hikers who passed near Geraldine's last camp carried their own fragments of her story forward. Some spoke of hearing voices faintly on the wind, indistinct but urgent. Others claimed to have seen the glint of a tent through the trees, only to approach and find nothing there. A few left offerings, small stones stacked at the base of trunks, feathers tied with string, words scribbled onto scraps of paper that they tucked into crevices. For them, the story was not over. It was ongoing, a conversation with the land itself, a reminder of how thin the barrier is between presence and absence. And yet, the cruel irony of her fate refused to loosen its grip. Geraldine had been less than 2 miles from the path, near enough to hear hikers moving, near enough to catch the hum of helicopters. The nearness gnawed at the searchers who had spent weeks combing the terrain. Many admitted privately that they could not walk a trail without wondering if another inchworm might be out there, alive, hidden, desperate, just beyond the line of sight. Some left the service entirely, worn down by guilt they could not shed. Others carried the memory as a caution, telling new recruits not just about the dangers of the terrain, but about the cruelty of chance, how a single step in the wrong direction can change everything. As the anniversaries passed, the media would return, drawing fresh attention to the story. Each article reanimated the same questions. Should she have carried a GPS beacon? Should she have stayed strictly to the trail? Should the search have been different? The debates rolled on, dissecting her choices like autopsy notes. But the family resisted that reduction. Geraldine was not a checklist of mistakes. She was a woman who had walked with joy, who had believed in her own endurance, who had been betrayed by the oldest trick the wilderness knows, hiding what is right in front of you. To frame her as a lesson was to miss the deeper truth of her humanity. Even so, the trail itself seemed determined to keep the lesson alive. Each year, hikers spoke her name with reverence, as though invoking protection. Some swore they felt her beside them in the lonelier stretches, a quiet encouragement urging them forward, reminding them that every step mattered. They whispered, inchworm to themselves, and the word became a kind of talisman. But others spoke of unease. They said the woods near her last sight pressed in closer, that the silence grew heavier, that they could never quite shake the sense that someone was just behind them, matching their pace in shadows. Her memory, it seemed, had fused with the trail itself, alive in every echo, every rustle of pine needles. George returned to Maine often in his later years, sometimes accompanied by Carrie, sometimes alone. He would stand at the edge of the forest, breathing the same air she had breathed, staring into the trees that had kept her secret. He rarely spoke, but those who stood near him knew what he was doing. He was listening, for her voice, for her presence, for anything the pines might give back. Those visits became a ritual, a way of keeping her close, of insisting that even if the forest had hidden her once, it could not silence her forever. The cruel truth was that the wilderness does not care. It does not grieve. It does not explain. But people do. And so Geraldine's story continued to echo, reshaped in every telling, transformed into both caution and legend. She had not simply been lost. She had been present, alive, waiting in plain sight while the world searched and failed. That was what made her story more than tragedy. It was irony sharpened into myth, sorrow preserved like a fossil in the soil. Even now, when hikers move through that stretch of Maine, they describe a change in the air. Some say it feels as though the trees lean closer, listening. Others say the silence deepens until they can hear their own heartbeat. And sometimes, in the hush of dusk, when the trail is nearly empty and the forest is a cathedral of shadows, they swear they hear it. A voice, faint but clear, carried on the wind. A woman calling out, patient, waiting still. Time passed, as it always does. But Geraldine's story refused to sink quietly into the soil. Her final days, preserved in ink, were not just words on a page. They were a presence. Hikers along the Appalachian Trail, whether they admitted it aloud or not, carried her with them. The knowledge that she had been so close to safety, yet invisible, became a shadow that followed every step. The trail had always been a place where triumph and tragedy shared the same ground. But after Geraldine, it seemed forever haunted by a reminder that the line between them was thinner than anyone wanted to believe. When news outlets revisited her story, it wasn't only to recount the horror of her final hours. They framed it as a parable. Some called her unprepared. Others saw her as a symbol of human fragility against the indifferent sprawl of nature. Debates raged about what could have been done differently. Should every hiker carry a beacon? Should the search teams have scoured differently? Should the trail itself be made safer? But behind the endless chatter was something quieter, heavier, an unease that no amount of analysis could dispel. Because the truth was not in the what-ifs. The truth was in the silence that swallowed her voice, the cruel fact that sometimes, no matter how loud you scream, the forest does not answer back. For her family, the aftermath never settled into peace. George lived on, but never again whole. Those who saw him in his final years said his grief was not like other griefs. It was not sharp but slow, a dull erosion of spirit. He had always been her companion, her partner, her anchor, and she had died alone waiting for him. That thought gnawed at him, an unhealed wound he carried into every room. Carrie and the others tried to comfort him, reminding him that Geraldine's journal had been filled with words of love, words that proved she was thinking of him until the very end. But grief is not logical. It does not listen to reason. It simply digs in deep and permanent. The journal itself became something more than paper. It was preserved, studied, archived, but also revered. For many who touched it, it felt almost like scripture, testimony written not by a preacher, but by a woman who had faced the end with courage and faith. She had written not only for herself, but for those she loved, as if leaving breadcrumbs of hope in the face of despair. It became a text people quoted in hiking forums, in grief groups, even in sermons. Geraldine's voice, denied the chance to call out loud enough to be heard in life, had found a way to echo after death. In that way, she was not lost at all. Yet the Appalachian Trail itself seemed to resist the comfort of tidy interpretations. It remained vast, dangerous, unknowable. Search and rescue workers spoke of other hikers who went missing, some found, some never. Geraldine was not the first and would not be the last. The wilderness does not bend for human stories. It simply endures. But her case lingered because of its cruel poetry, being so close, yet unseen. That image lodged itself into the imagination of anyone who heard it. People could not stop picturing her tent, just beyond the tree line, waiting. They could not stop hearing the imagined sound of her pen scratching against paper as helicopters droned above, so near, so deaf. Legends began to sprout. In campfire circles and trail towns, hikers traded whispers about inchworm. Some swore they had felt her presence guiding them, especially when they lost their bearings. Others spoke of dreams in which a woman pointed toward the path, her face both kind and sorrowful. A few claimed they had glimpsed a pale figure in the woods, kneeling near an invisible tent. Belief or imagination, the effect was the same. Her story bled into myth, a haunting reminder stitched into the identity of the trail itself. Those closest to her resisted the supernatural turn, holding tightly to the memory of the real woman. Geraldine, the nurse, the wife, the mother, the friend. But even they admitted there was something unshakable about the way her spirit seemed woven into the pines. Carrie said once in an interview that when she hiked, she sometimes spoke aloud to the forest, as though her mother might still be there. It's not about believing in ghosts, she explained. It's about believing she hasn't really left me, that she's still walking beside me. And so the trail carried on, endless and indifferent, but changed forever by one woman's absence. Every footstep echoed against her silence. Every lost hiker carried her memory as a warning. Every campfire sparked her story back into flame. The wilderness had taken her, but it had not erased her. If anything, it had amplified her, made her presence eternal in a way no ordinary life could have achieved. In the end, Geraldine Largay did not simply vanish. She endured. She endured in the journal she left behind, in the grief etched into her family, in the whispers of hikers who still walked the path she never finished. She endured in the uneasy knowledge that sometimes a forest swallows, and sometimes it gives back, but never without leaving its mark. Her story is not just about loss. It is about the human heart, fragile yet defiant, writing words of love into the silence, insisting on being remembered even when the world does not answer. And so when the wind moves to the pines of Maine and the trail grows still at dusk, there are those who swear they hear it. Not the crash of branches or the call of animals, but a softer sound. The sound of a pen against paper. The sound of a voice whispering a prayer. The sound of Geraldine, the inchworm, still waiting, still present, forever part of the wilderness that held her.